At 3:17 a.m. Moscow time this morning, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces completed what military analysts are calling the most consequential infrastructure disruption of the entire Black Sea campaign. The Kerch Strait Bridge, Vladimir Putin's $7 billion symbol of Crimean annexation and Russia's primary military supply artery into occupied territory, has been rendered completely inoperable for heavy military transport. What happened in those early morning hours represents not just an engineering achievement or a tactical victory, but a fundamental shift in the strategic calculus governing Russia's ability to sustain military operations across the entire southern theater. The bridge that Putin personally inaugurated in 2018, driving a truck across its span in a carefully choreographed propaganda event, now stands as a monument to the limits of Russian military power projection. What you are about to hear reveals why this single piece of infrastructure holds more strategic weight than entire battalion formations, and why its loss creates cascading consequences that extend far beyond Crimea itself. The Kerch Strait Bridge is not simply a road and rail connection. It is the primary logistics lifeline, sustaining approximately 28,000 Russian troops stationed throughout Crimea, providing fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and equipment replacement that cannot be adequately transported by any alternative means. Before this morning's operation, the bridge carried an estimated 14,000 tons of military cargo daily, representing roughly 60% of all supplies reaching Russian forces on the peninsula. The rail component moved heavy equipment, including tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and the massive quantities of ammunition required to sustain sustained combat operations. The road component transported fuel tankers, supply trucks, and personnel rotations that kept Russian units at operational readiness levels. Russian military planners spent years developing this supply infrastructure specifically because the alternatives proved inadequate during earlier conflicts. The land bridge through Mariupol and occupied Ukrainian territory extends supply lines by over 400 kilometers compared to the direct Kerch connection, adding days to transit times and exposing convoys to Ukrainian strikes across that entire distance. Sea transport across the Black Sea became increasingly dangerous as Ukrainian naval drones proved capable of striking even heavily defended vessels, and maritime routes cannot move the volume or weight of equipment that sustained ground operations require. Air transport lacks the capacity to move heavy armor and bulk supplies, and Russian transport aircraft operate under constant threat from Ukrainian air defense systems that have demonstrated remarkable effectiveness throughout this conflict. The bridge represented Russia's solution to these logistics challenges. Its destruction creates problems that have no immediate solution. Russian forces in Crimea now face supply constraints that will progressively degrade combat effectiveness over timelines measured in weeks, not months. The 28,000 troops stationed across the peninsula consume approximately 400 tons of ammunition daily during active operations, require 150,000 liters of fuel for vehicles and generators, and depend on regular equipment maintenance that demands constant spare parts flow. Without the bridge, delivering these supplies becomes exponentially more complex, time-consuming, and vulnerable to interdiction. The economic implications extend beyond purely military concerns. Crimea's civilian population of approximately 4 million people depends on the bridge for 40% of all consumer goods, including food, medicine, and fuel for heating and transportation. Russian subsidies that kept the peninsula economically functional flowed across that bridge in the form of cash transfers, pension payments, and government salaries, totaling roughly $1 billion annually. Tourism revenue that generated $850 million for the regional economy depended on Russian visitors who could drive across the bridge for weekend trips and summer vacations. That economic model disintegrates without reliable bridge access. Russian President Vladimir Putin built his entire Crimean annexation strategy around the bridge as the physical manifestation of permanent Russian control. The 2018 opening ceremony featured Putin personally driving a truck convoy across the span, flanked by construction workers in hard hats, with Russian state television broadcasting the event as evidence that Crimea's integration into Russia had become irreversible. Putin declared that day that the bridge connects the whole country and represents Russia's revival. The symbolism was deliberate. The bridge was not just infrastructure, but political statement, physical proof that Russia possessed the economic resources and engineering capability to permanently bind annexed territory into its national structure. That symbolism now operates in reverse. The bridge's inoperability demonstrates that Russia cannot protect even its most strategically critical infrastructure from Ukrainian special operations, cannot maintain supply lines to forces occupying Ukrainian territory, and cannot deliver on the promises of security and prosperity that justified annexation to Crimean residents. For Russian military planners, for Putin's political position, and for the broader strategic situation governing this conflict, the implications are profound and irreversible. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what comes next reveals the operational details of how Ukrainian forces accomplished what many Western analysts considered impossible, and why Russian response options range from inadequate to catastrophic. The operation that disabled the Kerch Bridge demonstrates sophistication that goes far beyond the truck bomb attack that damaged the structure in October 2022. That earlier strike, while spectacular and symbolically powerful, caused temporary disruption that Russian engineers repaired within months. This operation targeted structural elements in ways that create irreparable damage, requiring complete reconstruction of entire bridge sections, a project that would take years even under peacetime conditions with unlimited resources and no ongoing security threats. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces deployed what military engineers are identifying as a coordinated combination of underwater demolitions, targeting bridge supports, precision strikes against rail infrastructure using modified maritime drones, and likely pre-positioned explosive charges that detonated in sequence to maximize structural failure. The attack occurred at 3:17 a.m., the precise moment when a freight train carrying fuel tankers and ammunition was crossing the rail span. The timing was not coincidental. The train's weight, combined with the explosive force from its cargo, amplified the structural damage from the initial demolitions. The rail span collapsed completely into the Kerch Strait, taking the freight train with it. Russian sources confirm at least 47 personnel killed in the immediate explosions and collapse, though that figure likely represents significant undercount given the ammunition detonations that followed. The road spans, while not completely destroyed, sustained damage to support pylons that makes them structurally unsafe for heavy military vehicles. Russian engineers who inspected the damage this morning told Moscow that the bridge cannot carry tank transporters, heavy artillery, or fully loaded supply trucks without risk of catastrophic failure. The engineering analysis reveals why repair proves so difficult. The bridge spans 19 kilometers across the Kerch Strait, making it the longest bridge in Europe. The sections that collapsed sit in water depths reaching 18 meters, complicating underwater salvage and repair operations. The bridge was designed with multiple redundancies, but Ukrainian targeting eliminated those redundancies by striking multiple support columns simultaneously. Rebuilding requires bringing in specialized heavy equipment, floating cranes, underwater construction vessels, and massive quantities of concrete and steel, all of which must somehow reach the repair site through waters where Ukrainian naval drones have demonstrated they can operate freely. Russian military response to the attack began immediately, but revealed the fundamental dilemma facing Moscow. Russian air defense systems stationed around the bridge fired dozens of surface-to-air missiles at what operators believed were incoming drones, but the actual attack came from underwater approaches that air defense cannot address. Russian patrol boats that might have intercepted maritime threats were pulled back from the immediate vicinity of the bridge following a Ukrainian naval drone attack 3 weeks ago that sank 2 patrol craft and killed 23 sailors. Russian combat aircraft scrambled from bases in Crimea and southern Russia, but they arrived after the explosions had already occurred and found no targets to engage. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued a statement 6 hours after the attack claiming that traffic flow continues across alternative routes and that military supply operations remain uninterrupted. This statement is objectively false based on observed traffic patterns and logistics requirements. The land route through Mariupol extends supply lines by 400 kilometers, adds between 18 and 36 hours to transit times depending on convoy size and road conditions, and exposes vehicles to Ukrainian artillery strikes across multiple points along the route. Russian convoys attempting this alternative route over the past 12 hours have already suffered documented attacks near Berdyansk and Tokmak, destroying at least 7 supply trucks and killing an unknown number of personnel. The maritime alternative faces even worse prospects. Ukrainian naval drones have attacked Russian vessels in the Black Sea with increasing frequency and effectiveness over recent months. The October attack on the Russian landing ship Caesar Kunikov demonstrated that even heavily armed and defended warships remain vulnerable to these relatively inexpensive autonomous systems. Russian commercial vessels that might transport supplies refuse to operate in waters where Ukrainian capabilities pose uninsurable risks. The few vessels that continue operating demand hazard pay premiums that increase transportation costs by 400% while moving a fraction of the volume the bridge provided. Air transport represents the only truly secure supply route, but Russian transport aircraft lack the capacity to sustain 28,000 troops through airlift alone. Russian military transport aviation consists primarily of Il-76 and An-124 aircraft, with total daily lift capacity across the entire Black Sea theater estimated at approximately 2,800 tons under optimal conditions. Current operational availability of these aircraft runs significantly below nominal capacity due to sanctions-imposed maintenance difficulties, parts shortages, and crew fatigue from sustained operations. Even operating at maximum theoretical capacity, Russian transport aviation could deliver less than 20% of the daily supplies that previously crossed the bridge. And this assumes no Ukrainian interference, which seems increasingly unlikely given Ukrainian success striking Russian aircraft at airfields across occupied territory. The supply mathematics facing Russian forces in Crimea create a straightforward timeline toward operational degradation. With bridge supply flows cut, Russian units can maintain current operational tempo for approximately 12 to 15 days using existing stockpiles before ammunition shortages begin forcing reductions in artillery fire, air defense engagement rates, and ground operation scales. At 30 days without adequate resupply, Russian forces face choices between abandoning forward positions to consolidate supplies for defensive operations, or attempting to maintain current deployment patterns while accepting progressive capability erosion. At 60 days, Russian military effectiveness in Crimea drops below levels necessary to conduct coordinated offensive operations or defend against determined Ukrainian attacks. This timeline assumes Russian forces maintain strict supply discipline, avoid significant combat losses, and successfully implement alternative logistics arrangements. None of these assumptions appears realistic. Russian military logistics demonstrated chronic inefficiency throughout this conflict, with supply depots regularly storing ammunition alongside fuel, creating catastrophic secondary explosions when Ukrainian strikes hit storage facilities. Combat losses continue draining supplies faster than planners anticipate, particularly as Ukrainian forces press advantages against supply-constrained Russian positions. And the alternative logistics arrangements depend on routes and methods that Ukrainian forces can target far more easily than the bridge itself. But here is where the strategic calculation becomes truly extraordinary. Russian military leadership now faces a choice between unacceptable options, and the decision they make over the next 48 to 72 hours will likely determine the trajectory of this entire conflict for months to come. The first option is accepting progressive operational degradation in Crimea while attempting to rebuild bridge capacity through crash reconstruction programs that would take years. This option preserves Russian territorial claims to Crimea while acknowledging inability to sustain major offensive operations from the peninsula. Russian forces would consolidate into defensive positions around Sevastopol and critical infrastructure, abandon forward positions in northern Crimea and along the administrative boundary with Kherson Oblast, and essentially concede initiative to Ukrainian forces across the entire southern front. This strategic retreat would free Ukrainian forces currently tied down, defending against potential Russian advances from Crimea to redeploy toward offensive operations in Zaporizhzhia or Donetsk oblasts. It would eliminate Russian ability to threaten Odessa from Crimean positions, fundamentally changing the military balance along Ukraine's Black Sea coast. And it would constitute the first major Russian territorial abandonment of the conflict, creating domestic political challenges for Putin's position and morale problems for Russian forces across all theaters. The second option is attempting a massive emergency logistics mobilization to sustain Crimean forces through alternative routes despite the vulnerabilities. This requires dedicating thousands of additional trucks to supply convoy operations, exposing them to Ukrainian strikes along extended vulnerable routes. It requires accepting significantly higher losses in personnel, vehicles, and supplies to maintain delivery volumes. It requires diverting transport assets from other theaters, weakening Russian capabilities in Donetsk, Luhansk, and along the Russian border. And it requires continuing these emergency measures indefinitely because bridge reconstruction timelines extend years into the future. The resource requirements for this option are staggering. Replacing the bridge's 14,000 daily tons of cargo capacity through truck convoys requires approximately 700 heavy trucks, making the full round trip every single day, assuming no losses to Ukrainian attacks, no mechanical failures, no weather delays, and perfect logistics coordination. Russia does not have 700 heavy trucks to spare from other operations. Attempting this surge means stripping transport capacity from units across the entire theater, creating supply problems everywhere to solve the immediate crisis in Crimea. The third option represents the one Russian military planners understand, but political leadership cannot publicly acknowledge. Russian forces withdraw from Crimea entirely, avoiding the catastrophic supply collapse that otherwise becomes inevitable over the next several months. This withdrawal preserves Russian military units for defensive operations elsewhere, eliminates the massive logistics drain that sustaining isolated forces requires, and removes a strategic vulnerability that Ukrainian forces can exploit to destroy trapped Russian formations. This option is politically impossible for Putin. Crimean annexation represents the cornerstone of his entire foreign policy legacy, the achievement that restored Russian great power status in his narrative framework, the prize that justified every subsequent cost of this conflict. Abandoning Crimea voluntarily would constitute the most significant strategic defeat in modern Russian history, comparable to the Soviet collapse and carrying similar implications for regime stability. Putin cannot order this withdrawal and expect to remain in power. His political survival depends on preventing it. Yet the military logic pointing toward withdrawal grows stronger every day. The bridge remains inoperable. Russian generals who understand logistics mathematics and strategic vulnerability recognize that attempting to hold Crimea without adequate supply lines creates conditions for catastrophic defeat that damages not just the units trapped there, but Russia's broader military capability for years afterward. A surrounded and supply-starved force that fights until destruction loses not just the battle, but the soldiers, equipment, experience, and morale that cannot be quickly replaced. A force that withdraws in controlled fashion preserves those assets for future operations. The internal Russian debate over these options is happening right now, at this very moment, in crisis meetings in Moscow, where military officers present operational assessments to political leadership that does not want to hear them. This debate will determine Russian strategy not just in Crimea, but across the entire conflict over the next several months. Subscribe right now and make sure notifications are enabled, because the intelligence coming out of these meetings, the decisions being made in response to this crisis, and the Ukrainian preparations for exploiting Russian vulnerabilities represent the most significant strategic developments since the beginning of this conflict. And you need to understand exactly what they mean. The Ukrainian strategy that produced this bridge operation reflects sophisticated understanding of how infrastructure destruction creates cascading strategic effects that extend far beyond the immediate tactical impact. Ukrainian military planners did not target the Kerch Bridge primarily to disrupt current Russian supply flows, though that represents an important immediate benefit. They targeted the bridge to force Russia into an impossible strategic choice, where every option produces outcomes favorable to Ukrainian objectives.